Chapter 1: The Conspiracy in Austin. In early 2024, Austin's spring air carried the scent of new beginnings. But for her, it was the fragrance of a trap. The daughter of a well-known restaurant family, she was told she had a rare chance to secure the future by marrying a man from Dallas she barely knew. It was painted as honor, tradition, and strategy rolled into one. The man's family owned a major real estate company. On paper, it was a union of equals. Two dynasties merging resources to dominate both hospitality and property markets in Texas. Behind closed doors, it was a bailout. Her parents' chain was drowning in debt, and the deal promised a lifeline. She played the part expected of her. Smiles at luncheons, nods during planning meetings, graceful silence during long business dinners. The engagement parties looked like celebrations of love, but every toast was really a nod to projected quarterly gains. Her life had been reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet. Her parents' office calendar became a mirror of her own. Dates for dress fittings sat beside notes for bank meetings. Restaurant supply contracts were now linked to wedding commitments. Even the florist's invoice was stapled to a financing proposal. Every detail of her day was tethered to financial necessity. In the quiet of her small downtown apartment, she sifted through stray documents brought home by accident. Invoices, draft agreements, loan schedules. They all pointed to the same truth. Her marriage date was the trigger for a cascade of debt restructuring. Without the wedding, the deal collapsed. Late one night, she opened a folder labeled Confidential Vendor Agreements. Her name was typed in a clause between shipment guarantees and revenue targets, listed as an integral non-transferable asset. The word asset felt colder than any insult. She wasn't a daughter. She was collateral. That discovery burned into her mind. The next day, she began paying attention with new eyes. Every handshake between her father and the Dallas patriarch, every half-smile her mother gave during negotiations, every time the groom's family discussed her in third person, it was all business language wrapped in family ritual. She noticed how her opinions on the wedding were politely ignored. Choice of venue, music, even the gown designer, all decided in backroom discussions she wasn't invited to. When she did speak, responses were gentle but final. That's not how these things are done. Her circle of friends had grown smaller. Those who asked too many questions about the whirlwind engagement found themselves ghosted. Instead, her days were filled with curated introductions to important people, bankers, developers, investors. Each conversation circled back to her marriage like moths to a single light. The groom was polite, almost careful, but distant. In private moments, she saw flickers of doubt in his eyes, yet he played his part as she did hers. Their exchanges stayed within the safe borders of formality, neither daring to step into honesty. She realized the families were staging them as a brand. Magazine features, charity appearances, and even staged candid photos at restaurants her parents owned. They were no longer individuals. They were marketing tools for a merger disguised as a wedding. In moments of solitude, she found herself staring at her reflection, wondering if her face even belonged to her anymore. Every smile felt rehearsed, every gesture calculated for an audience. She couldn't recall the last time she had done something purely for herself. Then, one evening, while flipping through a binder of vendor contracts left on her kitchen counter, she noticed a tab marked Event Contingencies. Beneath it lay a clause detailing penalties if the wedding was postponed or canceled, financial losses projected down to the cent. Her existence was risk-assessed. Her breathing quickened as she read further. Meetings with lenders were scheduled to conclude the morning after the ceremony, using the union as proof of renewed solvency. The realization was dizzying. Her vows were part of a credit package. For days, she walked through rehearsals and fittings in a trance. The clink of champagne glasses, the swish of silk dresses, the perfumed air, all felt like props on a stage where she had been cast without consent. Still, she understood that open rebellion before the wedding would destroy her parents' business instantly. They would see her as reckless, ungrateful, maybe even treacherous. If she acted, She would have to choose her moment with precision. She began to think differently about the ceremony, not as an inevitability, but as a stage. The one place where everyone who had treated her as currency would be gathered in the same room, expecting obedience. The thought took root and refused to leave. In the quiet, she imagined the silence that would follow a revelation at the altar, the expressions on her parents' faces, the sudden collapse of their polished facade. From that night on, she collected information methodically. Emails accidentally copied to her, overheard phone calls, stray documents. Each piece was stored in a hidden folder, her arsenal for the day she would no longer play her assigned role. The city outside bustled with spring festivals and live music, but her world had narrowed to one date circled in red. Everyone thought it marked the start of her married life. She knew it would mark something else entirely. Alone in her apartment, she wrote the first line of a note that would never be sent. This was never about love. Then she closed the notebook and began planning the rest. Chapter 2. Allies in the Script. The groom, a young architect burdened with the image of a privileged heir, had lived most of his life in the shadow of family expectations. His public role was crafted by others, from the way he dressed to the projects he was assigned. In private, he had begun to chafe under the constant weight of being a symbol rather than a person. His understanding of her situation grew quietly, not through questions but through deliberate acts. One afternoon, he arrived with photocopies of contracts from his family's office. The documents bore odd inconsistencies, payment schedules misaligned with completion dates, clauses that subtly shifted risk. He placed them in her hands without explanation. These silent offerings became the beginning of their alliance. She recognized that his life, too, was scripted, though the set pieces differed. Both were actors in productions they hadn't written, their movements dictated by families who measured value in influence and revenue. They began to meet in spaces untouched by either family's reach. Small coffee houses on the outskirts of town, corners of public libraries, anonymous park benches. Each meeting was purposeful. The fragments they gathered were spread out and studied like pieces of a strategic map. The map was not of geography, but of influence. Sponsors who funded public events in exchange for construction permits. Contractors tied by loyalty and debt. A PR agency skilled at reshaping narratives. Bankers who monitored every move. City officials, some discreetly indebted, and the ever-present society press. She became the archivist of their findings. On a hidden drive, she stored emails demanding kickbacks in exchange for favorable bids, messages instructing managers to depress wages quietly, and the draft of an asset division agreement that activated only with their marriage certificate. One evening, he brought her a small flash drive. On it was a video file. The recording, captured without notice, showed her father in conversation with a prominent developer. They discussed expediting a building permit through a charitable donation, a transaction framed as goodwill but negotiated like currency. The evidence was layered. Individually, each piece might seem suspicious. Together, they formed a lattice of intent, revealing the true machinery behind the ceremony. She organized them chronologically, marking the dates that overlapped with wedding milestones. From there, her mind turned toward execution. The wedding, they both understood, would be the perfect convergence of their families' networks. Guests would include those who profited most from the arrangement, as well as those who would recoil at seeing their own names tied to corruption. She contacted the ceremony coordinator under the guise of wanting a modern multimedia element for distant relatives. Her request was specific. The event's large display screen should be able to accept a direct feed from a separate operator. The coordinator, intrigued by the idea, agreed without hesitation. For the operator, she hired an independent videographer, introduced as a specialist in live streaming for international audiences. His role would be simple in appearance but pivotal in effect. His equipment would bypass the official feed, sending images directly from her curated files to the venue's display. The cover story was airtight. The videographer's presence was justified by the inclusion of overseas family members who could not attend. The coordinator saw it as a thoughtful gesture. The families saw it as harmless ornamentation. No one asked questions. The groom refined their list of targets, noting which revelations would land hardest with specific attendees. Some guests would be shaken by financial impropriety, others by evidence of political manipulation. The impact would come from knowing their names were linked. She rehearsed the sequence in her mind, visualizing the moment when the audience's polite expressions would shift to shock. It was not vindictiveness she felt, but a deep, focused clarity, an understanding that this was the only way to dismantle the facade without disappearing under its weight. At night, she studied the flow of the ceremony. Each segment offered opportunities: the vows, the speeches, the toasts. They decided the reveal should happen at a point where the guests were fully settled, when interruption would carry maximum disruption. Meanwhile, the archive grew. Anonymous tips arrived through encrypted channels. One was a scanned ledger from a supplier, showing inflated invoices signed by a family proxy. Another was a calendar invite for a meeting titled Post-Wedding Asset Transfer, scheduled precisely 3 hours after the planned ceremony. Every addition tightened the weave of their plan. The files were not just evidence. They were a narrative in themselves, one that could unfold on a screen in real time, telling the guests a story they would never forget. The more they worked together, the more a quiet trust formed between them. It was not romance in the traditional sense, but an alliance born of mutual recognition. Each knew the other had as much to lose as to gain, and neither could afford betrayal. The weeks passed in a rhythm of secrecy. Publicly, they fulfilled their roles, tasting cakes, approving floral arrangements, posing for engagement photos. Privately, they built the scaffolding of a spectacle designed to collapse the very stage on which it stood. By the end of their planning, the day of the wedding had taken on a dual identity. For their families, it was the crowning moment of years of maneuvering. For them, it was the stage for a controlled detonation, one that would scatter carefully hidden truths into the open air. And in that duality lay the power of their script. The same event that was meant to bind them in silence would instead give them both a voice, amplified by the presence of every person who had once assumed their compliance. Chapter 3. Rehearsal as Reconnaissance. A week before the wedding, the historic mansion chosen as the venue stood like a relic of wealth, its polished floors and crystal chandeliers reflecting the careful power of those who booked it. For the families, this was the day to perfect every detail. For her, it was a chance to map the battlefield. The parents moved through the grand hall with clipboards in hand, adjusting the seating chart. Sponsors and city officials occupied the prime tables, their placement calculated for maximum visibility and influence. The rest of the guests were positioned like supporting actors around the main players. Toasts were rehearsed with precision. Each was timed to the second, with certain speakers instructed to include promises of charitable donations. These vows were less about generosity and more about signaling to key investors and municipal partners. She memorized the order, knowing exactly when attention would peak. As the rehearsal unfolded, she took mental notes on the position of every camera. The official photographers favored sweeping angles from the balcony, while videographers set up near the aisle. She identified blind spots where her independent operator could work unnoticed. The lighting was its own map. Warm pools of illumination highlighted the altar, the sweetheart table, and the main stage. She traced how the spotlight shifted during speeches, and how the side lighting caught the edges of the large display screen at the back of the hall. The screen itself was tested with a slideshow of smiling engagement photos. She studied the brightness, the contrast, the way it drew the eyes of every person in the room. From certain seats there was no escape. The images commanded attention. That would be her lever. By the end of the day, she had a mental blueprint: camera placements, light sources, lines of sight. She also knew where the videographer could plug in without triggering suspicion, blending seamlessly into the existing technical setup. That evening, back in her apartment, she uploaded her curated archive to a secure cloud service. The files were set with a delayed publication timer, synchronized to the exact hour of the ceremony. a single journalist from a local investigative outlet was granted access. The journalist was known for precision and restraint, someone who valued verification over sensationalism. For her, this choice ensured the information would not be dismissed as gossip. If the screen failed, the story would still go public before the end of the day. On a separate encrypted flash drive, she compiled a clean packet of documents. These were intended for the marriage registrar, contracts showing that the corporate merger would activate 3 hours after the exchange of rings. The simplicity of the paperwork was its weapon. She placed the flash drive in a slim envelope and stored it in a hidden compartment of her handbag. The contents were her safeguard, a piece that could halt the legal side of the marriage even if the public reveal faltered. Meanwhile, the groom played his role in the plan. During a quiet moment in the rehearsal, he approached the ceremony officiant, speaking with measured calm. He requested a brief pause during the exchange of vows, framing it as a personal touch for a private word to the bride. The officiant, charmed by the sentiment, agreed without hesitation. The pause would give them a perfectly timed opening to trigger the feed on the display screen, without disrupting the flow of the ceremony in a way that might draw premature interference. Over the next hour, she walked the perimeter of the mansion's main hall again, this time noting escape routes. She marked where side doors led to service corridors and where the back terrace offered discreet exits. It was not paranoia, but preparation. She even counted the number of steps from the altar to the nearest side exit. In her mind, she ran the sequence, the screen lighting up, the murmurs rising, and her movement toward the registrar before chaos could block her path. The rehearsal dinner that followed was another study in roles. Guests laughed, glasses clinked, and the air buzzed with anticipation. She smiled when expected, spoke in measured tones, and gave no sign of the alternative script running beneath the evening. At one point, a city council member approached her parents with a congratulatory handshake. She caught the faint exchange of an unmarked envelope, slid casually across the tablecloth. It was a reminder that the stage she would disrupt was built on many such invisible gestures. Later, as she left the mansion, she glanced back at its lit windows. Inside, the families were still mingling, discussing final touches and confirming arrivals. To them, the next week was about sealing alliances. To her, it was about dismantling them. That night, she lay awake, replaying every detail she had gathered. The images of the rehearsal hall merged with the files stored in her cloud archive. It felt like holding 2 versions of the same day, the one they expected and the one she intended to deliver. She understood the risk. A single technical glitch, a premature warning, or a misplaced file could unravel the entire plan. Yet the rehearsal had shown her that control was not absolute, that even in a stage-managed event, there were cracks large enough for truth to slip through. By morning, her notes from the day had been rewritten into a clear action sequence. The next time she stepped into that hall, every movement would be deliberate. The rehearsal was over. The performance, her performance, was nearly ready to begin. Chapter 4. The Altar as a Podium. The morning of the wedding unfolded with the precision of a corporate launch. Every element, from the floral arches to the champagne flutes, was arranged to signal wealth and influence. The air outside the mansion carried the low hum of luxury cars rolling up the drive, engines idling as chauffeurs opened doors for partners and officials. Local news crews gathered near the entrance, their cameras capturing the slow procession of guests. Laughter and polite greetings mingled with the clicking of lenses. Each arrival was another frame in the public narrative the families wanted to present, one of unity, tradition, and prosperity. Inside, the hall shimmered under the light of chandeliers. Soft strings played from a quartet positioned near the grand staircase, the music carefully selected to evoke solemnity. Guests took their seats in choreographed waves, each usher knowing exactly which table held which level of importance. The bride walked down the aisle under a canopy of whispers. Her dress, a custom creation, shimmered with each step. She met the groom at the altar with a practiced expression of grace, her hands steady even as her mind ticked through the sequence to come. The officiant welcomed the guests, speaking in a warm, resonant tone. The ceremony began as expected: readings, blessings, the occasional polite cough from the audience. Yet, beneath the surface, tension coiled like a wire ready to snap. When the moment for vows arrived, the groom reached for the microphone. His expression softened into something intimate, drawing the audience closer with the promise of a personal word. The officiant stepped back, granting him the space they had arranged. Behind them, the large display screen flickered. At first, it showed a loop of congratulatory slides, engagement photos, childhood snapshots, images of shared vacations. Smiles spread among the guests, the collective mood warm and expectant. The transition came slowly, almost imperceptibly. A slide faded into a scanned letter marked with accounting annotations. Another followed, showing a flowchart of bank transfers. A third revealed a timeline aligning the wedding date with the activation of a substantial credit line. Murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. A few guests leaned forward, frowning at the screen. Others exchanged glances, recognizing the significance of the documents. The soundtrack of the ceremony was replaced by the sound of shifting seats and rising whispers. The images grew sharper in implication: internal memos, email excerpts, and finally, a recorded video. The voices of her father and a developer filled the hall, speaking openly about expediting a building permit in exchange for a discreet donation. The wave of discomfort in the audience became tangible. Some turned their heads toward the high-profile officials seated near the front. The calculated elegance of the day was fraying at the edges, the quiet hum of power replaced with the restless buzz of scandal. From the control station near the back, the coordinator activated the secondary feed. The independent live stream cut in, showing the same material but overlaid with a bold caption: "Public commitments of the family and terms of marriage." At the press table, assistants began handing out cards printed with QR codes. A few journalists scanned them immediately, their screens filling with the complete digital archive. The news was already moving beyond the confines of the hall. Her father, pale but rigid, rose from his seat. He moved toward the technical booth, his voice raised in sharp commands to shut down the display. The technician only shook his head. The feed was synced to an external server beyond their reach. Her mother stood abruptly, skirts brushing against the chairs as she strode toward the altar. Her hand extended toward the microphone, intent on regaining control. The officiant, still in position, announced a brief, technical pause in a calm, rehearsed voice. In that stillness, the bride reached for a slim folder she had placed beside her bouquet. The gesture was deliberate, the sound of paper audible even over the subdued chaos. Inside was the statement of refusal to register the marriage, accompanied by a pre-signed declaration voiding the business contract. The groom stood beside her, his signature already present on the document. His posture was steady, lending quiet confirmation to their mutual choice. The officiant, now aware of the weight of the moment, stepped aside without objection. The audience, frozen between disbelief and fascination, watched as she closed the folder. In her eyes, there was no hesitation, only the calm certainty of someone reclaiming her narrative in the most public way possible. The screen behind them continued to cycle through the evidence, each frame a nail in the coffin of the deal their families had built. In that hall, beneath the glittering chandeliers, the altar had become a podium, and the vows had transformed into a verdict. What had been designed as the pinnacle of family alliance now stood as the stage for its unraveling. The performance was over, and the truth, once revealed, could not be folded back into silence. Chapter 5: The Collapse of the Facade. Through the night, the files released during the ceremony spread across the city's media channels. Local reporters dissected the documents, and commentary programs replayed the screen footage in slow motion, pausing on every incriminating line. By morning, the scandal was no longer confined to the wedding hall. It was the city's lead story. At dawn, the first inspectors arrived at the family's flagship restaurant. Their presence was deliberate and public, clipboards in hand, cameras trailing behind. Health and safety checks were carried out under the watchful eyes of news crews, each moment adding to the narrative of a business under siege. Other locations were visited throughout the day. Staff whispered nervously in kitchens and stockrooms, glancing toward the front doors each time a suited figure appeared. Customers hesitated before entering, their curiosity mingled with suspicion. The bank, alerted by the footage and subsequent reports, issued a formal request for clarification. The promised credit line was frozen pending investigation, halting the financial maneuver that had been central to the marriage arrangement. Internal calls between the bank and the family's accountants became urgent and clipped. The charitable foundation named in the leaked recording moved quickly. By mid-morning, it issued a public statement condemning any form of pressure or exchange for expedited permits. The message was sharp, leaving no room for reinterpretation. Suppliers and contractors began to reassess their commitments. Without the safety net of family-backed guarantees, they demanded revised contracts or suspended deliveries entirely. Projects stalled, and kitchens ran on reduced inventories. Inside the family's residence, the atmosphere was brittle. Parents summoned lawyers for an emergency meeting, the dining table now serving as a war room. Papers were spread out, laptops open, phones constantly buzzing with updates and demands. It was during this meeting that they discovered an unexpected obstacle. 2 key properties, considered part of their collateral, were not legally tied to their holdings. They had been gifted years earlier by the bride's grandmother directly to her, bypassing the family trust. These assets, while small in number, were strategically significant, locations in prime districts that could anchor new ventures. The realization hit with the weight of an unanticipated loss of leverage. Within hours, she acted. The properties were transferred into a newly formed trust dedicated to funding an independent culinary incubator. The legal paperwork was filed swiftly, cutting any chance for her parents to challenge the move before it became binding. Her next step was public. Standing in a modest kitchen space, she recorded an open address to the employees of her family's restaurant chain. She spoke plainly about transparency, fair wages, and professional respect. She invited staff to join the new incubator project, promising contracts without hidden clauses and profit-sharing structures that rewarded contribution. Her message spread quickly through private group chats and social media posts among employees. The groom took his own decisive action. He formally severed ties with his family's development office, a move that drew immediate attention in industry circles. His resignation letter cited a commitment to ethical practice, though its true meaning was understood by all who had seen the wedding broadcast. That same day, he submitted a packet to the city's planning committee. Inside were copies of the emails and recordings showing undue influence over permit approvals. His name on the cover lent credibility, but the evidence spoke for itself. The committee, under public scrutiny, acknowledged receipt and opened an inquiry. The announcement was brief but widely reported, adding another layer of pressure on both families. By late afternoon, the coordinated structure the parents had built over decades was unraveling. Meetings were canceled, phone calls went unanswered, and allies distanced themselves. The polished image they had guarded so fiercely was now cracked beyond repair. In the city's dining scene, whispers shifted from shock to anticipation. Chefs, managers, and small business owners speculated about the incubator's potential, seeing it as a rare opportunity to step out from under established monopolies. The bride and groom, now allies in more than circumstance, watched the events unfold from separate corners of the city. Their actions had shifted the balance of power, not just in their families but in the industries tied to them. The fallout was far from over. Investigations would take months, and the media's interest would ebb and flow. Yet the irreversible damage had been done. The facade was no longer just cracked. It had collapsed in full view of everyone who had once admired its shine. And beneath the rubble, something new was beginning to take shape. Chapter 6, Freedom and a New Structure. 3 months after the wedding, Austin's East Side saw the opening of a culinary incubator, unlike anything in the city. The converted warehouse smelled of fresh bread and grilled spices, its stalls lined with small bakeries and street food vendors. Many of the first residents were former chefs and managers from her family's restaurant chain. The space pulsed with energy. Bright murals covered the walls, telling stories of food, heritage, and resilience. Tables were arranged to encourage conversation between vendors and customers, turning every meal into an exchange of ideas. She had established clear policies from the start. Profits would be shared according to contribution, not hierarchy. Monthly reports would be open to all members, ensuring transparency in a world where hidden clauses had once been the norm. A mentorship program paired experienced restaurateurs with newcomers. Skills in business planning, marketing, and food safety were taught alongside recipes, giving the vendors tools to sustain themselves beyond the incubator's walls. The governance board was composed entirely of independent professionals, chefs, accountants, and community organizers with no ties to either of the families involved in the wedding scandal. Decisions were made collectively, and no single member could override the group's vote. The city council, still under scrutiny after the revelations, launched a formal audit of permitting practices. Meetings were open to the public, and residents attended in record numbers, eager to see the systems that had once operated in the shadows brought into daylight. Her former parents, now distanced by both law and choice, were forced to restructure their business. Without access to her assets or influence, they downsized, closing unprofitable locations and renegotiating supplier contracts under far stricter terms. The scandal that had begun at the altar became a touchstone in local education. University courses on media ethics and corporate governance analyzed the event as a modern case study, dissecting the risks of turning personal milestones into business transactions. Students debated the turning point of the day, when the display screen shifted from images of celebration to evidence of corruption. Professors pointed to it as an example of strategic disruption in a controlled environment. The groom, now running his own small architectural firm, collaborated with the incubator to design modular stalls and energy-efficient kitchens. His work embodied the same principles that had guided their rebellion: adaptability, integrity, and independence. Vendors thrived under the new system. A taco stand expanded into a brick-and-mortar restaurant. A family-run bakery received a grant to open a second location. The incubator became not only a business hub, but a symbol of second chances. Visitors from other cities came to study its model. Community leaders from as far as Seattle and Denver toured the facility, taking notes on its structure and the cultural momentum it generated. The success was measurable in both revenue and morale. Inside her office, sunlight streamed through tall windows onto a single framed photograph. It showed the wedding hall at the moment everything changed, the display screen alive with truth, her arm raised holding the folder that ended the contract. The image was not a trophy, but a reminder. It marked the day she had chosen her voice over her role, transforming what was meant to be an act of compliance into a declaration of self-determination. She kept the folder itself in a locked drawer. On some mornings, she would take it out, running her fingers over the embossed seal, remembering the weight of it in her hands at the altar. For her, freedom was not the absence of ties, but the right to choose them. Every new vendor accepted into the incubator signed an agreement that mirrored this belief, a contract built to protect choice rather than to bind it. As the months passed, the initial shock of the scandal faded from headlines, replaced by stories of the incubator's achievements. Yet for those who had been there, the memory of that day remained vivid, a shared lesson in the cost and value of truth. In the community, her name became less associated with the wedding and more with the thriving network of small food businesses she had nurtured. Reputation had shifted from scandal to stewardship. The photograph on her wall stood as quiet proof that defiance could be a form of strategy, and that the final chapter of any story belonged to the one willing to write it themselves.